Okay, so this talk is going to be mostly a history lesson about how we got to the location we are today with ES modules and talking a little bit about standards bodies and my social interactions getting here. So a brief bit about my history. I started using Node when it wasn't even 0.2. I've been involved in the community since then, but I've always been interested in having new features for modules. I worked at build systems for Nodejitsu, made jar-like archive loader already. GoDaddy released a CI/CD system earlier today, and I have a ton of random modules on NPM. So we're going to just jump right in and start with the first attempt of JavaScript modules with ES4. If you've ever heard about ES4, it is a completely different language from JavaScript as we know today. It had a lot of very interesting ideas. It had a type system. It also had this thing called packages. And there are 2 entire paragraphs in the spec for ES4 about what a package is. And it's going to be similar to what we consider a jar archive for what a package is, but it's all in the same source file, so it would be under the same .js file. And namespaces are just kind of like C# namespaces or C++ namespaces. You can declare this identifier where you want other variables to live within. And this is around 2008. Around 2008, TC39 decides to scrap ES4. It's just too hard to implement, too complex, and essentially it's too big of a change. But the important thing here is it had a concept of packages and a concept of namespaces. It doesn't really talk about modules. And these things were drastically different from what Node thinks of as modules. And so as this gets scrapped, we move on, and people still need modules. They need some way to be able to load multiple files and have them coordinate their variables. And so Mozilla comes along in 2009, and it actually works with some members of TC39 and creates the CommonJS module specification, which strictly exports dictionary objects, so what we think of as object literals with string properties as their keys and whatever value you want at that string property. Much like we were talking about with Node modules in a bit, any implementation of CommonJS modules uses a function to wrap any given source text. So if you have a .js file, it changes from what browsers historically have seen as this script file that runs at the top level to a function body. And that doesn't really sound like much, but it changes parts of the grammar and parts of what you can do. Like suddenly we have a concept of early return. So if you've ever had, I don't know, if process env.debug return because you don't want your module to load, if you're in a debug mode, this is the first time we start to see something like that. And much like what ES modules will be, the loader is entirely left up to the environment. It's left up to Node, a browser, CouchDB, Ringo, anything to implement the loader, which is what takes the files on disk, determines what type of file they are, and actually puts it into the VM. And so this actually gains a fair bit of traction. It's the first real module loader that's adopted by multiple projects that are or become popular. We're at a Node conference, so you can assume Node picks it up. There's also another project called RequireJS, and that's using Java, and it is strictly adhering to CommonJS. It doesn't have a lot of the differing features that Node has. And interestingly, CouchDB has a CommonJS loader embedded inside of that. So with 2009, we get CommonJS modules. A quick follow, when Node is released towards the end of 2009, we start to see Node's implementation of CommonJS. So CommonJS doesn't really specify anything about path semantics. So when I'm talking about path semantics, I'm talking about file paths, what the file extensions do, if you search for different file extensions, or even how Node modules works at all. The prevailing assumption up until this point is that when you load a path, there is one and only one resource that can live at that path. Node changes this. It starts to search the file path, like a path variable for your environment. It starts looking for things in, .js files versus .json files. And this is the first time where we start to diverge from having one-to-one mappings of paths to having multiple resources potentially imported by the same string. It's also the main time where we have this idea of a single value of export. When we were talking about CommonJS earlier, we're talking about a dictionary object. It's always an object, and it always has string properties declared for what you can import. Node took a different approach here. It said whatever is at module.exports is the value for the entire module. So we're no longer limited to just generating a single object. We can have an export that is a function. So if you require request, for example, off NPM, we can use it as a function. It's not strictly an object, so we don't have to do require request.request or anything like that. And we introduce a few special context variables. At the same time, require.js shows up. So in terms of age, AMD and Node CommonJS are actually pretty similar. It's very hard to determine which showed up first. Require.js was made from lessons learned on the browser side of things, so it has different priorities. It's going and taking everything needs to be asynchronous, things need to be loaded in parallel, but it shares some commonalities with CommonJS and Node. It has single value exports like Node does. It doesn't follow the CommonJS dictionary path. It wraps any given source text in a function, and when you're using it, it feels a little bit interesting. It's something that Node tried to implement for a while with require.async, and it never really took off. There were some complexities of it, and there was a lot of verbosity. But unfortunately, require.js doesn't really have a specification. It has some documentation on how require.js works, but it's what it is. There is no standards body behind it. There's not a team of people trying to define the behavior or edge cases. And it actually goes and calls out CommonJS in its description of itself. And it basically states that CommonJS didn't work in the browser, so we had to make something new. Among those new things that we're going to start seeing at this point is NPM shows up the next year in 2010. So we were talked about, there were multiple paths that could have multiple resources backing them. So NPM shows up, and we start to see node modules directories. So we start seeing people install modules just using a tool, put it in a directory, and suddenly it works. You can update your directory, and it'll keep working. This eventually lands in Node, and it's interesting just because this change to Node's documentation and specification came from userland. And this is something that I want to stress, especially with standards bodies. It's very uncommon, to my knowledge, for userland to land exactly into spec. Usually it's the other way around, where spec mandates what happens in userland, in my experience. Because specifications go through weird edge cases, they go through problems with grammar, And they just discuss all sorts of stuff, all sorts of things that the average programmer will probably never see. Yeah. And so at this point, TC39 starts writing what we are going to call ES modules. It's what's eventually going to become the standard that we're going to be seeing in the future in browsers and in Node. It has completely new semantics. Everything we've talked about up until this point uses some sort of value semantics, meaning when you're sharing something, you're sharing a value. It's almost like a copy operation. ES modules, they share variables. So when I'm going and trying to import or export something, I'm telling you that this variable is available to be imported into another scope. I'm not saying the value is. So if I change the value at that variable, it gets updated everywhere that it is in scope. So that's something that is not visible in any of the other specifications up to this point. And it's also interesting because it introduces a new top-level parser to the JavaScript language. I don't have a good example of any other language that does this. There are things where they run code differently, such as Perl modules versus Perl scripts, header files versus C or C++ files, but they don't parse differently. So there's some interesting things here that we're going to touch on in a bit. So after TC39 starts writing up all of this, Isaac Schluter, the guy who wrote NPM's command line and currently in charge of NPM Inc., wrote this pretty good blog post about there are some problems with how ES modules look. TC39 goes, sees these problems, and decides to make some changes to the specification. In particular, it's trying to support the use cases that are brought up in this blog post and give more attention to use cases that Node has. They don't have too much publicly on this. There are notes for any TC39 meeting. Node isn't really brought up in the meeting notes, so most of these discussions are kind of lost, and I don't have any way to recover them. But there's disagreement on whether things are about use cases, which is how I feel, or whether they were seeking for full compatibility, which is how some people feel when discussing this point about TC39 going and changing the spec. So suddenly we have this gap of time. We've gone from 2010 to 2014. So we jumped 4 years. Babel shows up. It's called 6.5 at the time, and it's implementing a compiler of ES6 syntax to ES5. So it's shipping the syntax for ES modules, but it's using CommonJS semantics and compiling it down to CommonJS syntax. We were talking briefly about how CommonJS is value-based and ES modules are binding or variable-based. So there's a problem here. It's not spec compliant, in part because the parser in Babel to this day is not spec compliant. It has imports in places it shouldn't according to the grammar, and the semantics are falling back to Node's implementation. Node uses a different type of import and export system. It has a different cache mechanism. It has a different way of determining what a module is and what is a script. So 6.5 is something that's really interesting. It gets people excited. But then you go and you look back on it, and the author of Babel basically agrees interop between CommonJS, Node's CommonJS in this point, and ES modules is a massive rabbit hole of problems. So the next year, things start heating up for TC39. They're going to land ES modules. And so they actually have this entire loader spec that's built on this asynchronous registry and cache mechanism. It looks a lot like what AMD is, but they can't get it to work with Node. It's very complex, and they leave it up to the host environment, just like CommonJS did in the past. And so they remove it from the spec. Node has a little bit of participation with TC39. Once again, there's nothing really pertinent in the meeting notes about this. And Babel is mentioned as an implementation and one of the reasons that it can be thought of as being done. TC39 has since changed the requirements to land things in the ES specification to require at least 2 implementations that are spec compliant, rather than do something like adopting Babel as an implementation example. After this, IOJS forms, and eventually it becomes the Node Foundation, and Node is re-energized because there's been this big war of who is the governing body of Node, and it becomes more open to change. And at this point, I start to step in. I'm at NodeSource. I'm investigating the details of what implementing ES modules will take. I see this loader spec that was pulled out of the TC39 specification, and it's chaos. There are promises everywhere, which we can't really do if we're doing a synchronous loader, because that's what Babel is doing. The order of operations differs slightly. So if we want to maintain compatibility of your side effects, if you're doing something where you have to require something before something else, things start to get confusing, circular dependencies. And so we eventually have a Google Hangout with the TC39 members. And it's basically a ton of flowcharts everywhere. And at this point, I end up finding myself unemployed. So this slowed me down. You can imagine. But it also gave me plenty of time to investigate things because I wasn't doing anything. So that's great. At the same time, the browsers are shipping a completely new loader spec, completely unrelated to what was originally in TC39's ES module spec. And this is what they're going to ship in the future. So that whole talk we had about having a loader spec pulled out of the ES modules and the JavaScript specification, it's pretty much gone. We're going to have some different stuff. So I eventually write an enhancement proposal for Node. The new governance is really nice, makes it easy. I can say things. We can support it if VMs give us these hooks. It isn't strictly spec breaking to implement it, but it's a big change for a VM to be able to support what we plan out. And we're planning basically to have 100% interop with Babel. And our idea to determine if it's a module or a script comes down to double parsing. This is a PR with 676 comments, not including the issue threads leading up to this PR. This PR probably took 6 months of my life away from me in the comment threads. So I end up going and rewriting it after a bunch of feedback. And so we start talking, well, let's use a file extension because there's some problems and potential ambiguities if we use parsing. And if you've got ambiguity, that's no good. So we start talking about using a new file extension. We remove problematic features of CommonJS from what we will support for ES modules, which means breaking some stuff from Babel at this point. And the CTC for Node accepts this as the draft. So I'm running low on time, but there are Twitter flame wars for around 2 months after this. It's just terrible. It's TC39, me, and some other members of Node kind of having hissy fits. And then eventually we go back to the Node EP after all of this. We decide we need to change the spec in order to implement ES modules in any form or fashion. We can't do what Babel does because Babel isn't spec compliant. So we need to either change the specification or use a different expectation for developers on how ES modules are going to work. And that means we either have this spec change or we potentially break people using Babel, which is a lot of people. So that's not good because we value the people in the ecosystem that's on NPM. So GoDaddy goes and buys a TC39 seat, and we go in July and talk about changing the specification. It didn't really look great for changing the specification at the time. We rewrite the Node EP with the idea in mind that we're going to break Babel users. And we start talking about a purely async loader. Currently, this is where we are at right now. We went and had the TC39 meeting in September to discuss the problems holding Node from implementing stuff. There's some agreement that we should loosen the constraints of ES modules, but we still have pending issues. Even earlier this morning, we're talking, there's a TC39 meeting going on at the same time as this conference, so it's a little awkward. But that's where we are. So that's the history.
Want to take them offline if that's okay with you?
Yeah, if you have questions, I'll be outside, and eventually I'll end up at the GoDaddy booth in the Solutions Salon. So.